Mikhail, I will keep an eye to the chat, so if I see any questions coming, I will let you know.
Okay, please.
Yeah, great.
And it'll be up to you, Mikhail, either to answer these questions immediately or to wait until then and then have a discussion.
Yeah, so it's like kind of, we could follow both ways, like asking questions during the talk or after the talk. So please interrupt me anytime if you don't understand something or I'm explaining.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, I think it's about time to begin. I would like to welcome everyone to our first seminar after the new year. And we are very pleased to have as our speaker tonight, Mikhail Mamonov, who represents the Center for International Economic Research at the MGIMO. And he is also a PhD candidate from CERGE-EI University in Prague. Mikhail's professional career is a bit unusual for this seminar because he spent a fair amount of time at one of Russia's most prominent applied economics think tank, Center for Economic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, which was established by Mr. Belousov, who is now Russia's Deputy Prime Minister. Mikhail has done quite a bit of good work on finance, banking, and tonight he's going to talk about Quo Vadis, about how Russian banks and firms responded to increased scrutiny and stricter control of the banking industry. Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leonid, for this nice introduction. Yeah, so indeed, I spent 10 years in policy analysis, and then I understood that like that's too much, and I want something else and turn to academia. Okay, or trying to turn to academia still. Okay, so the slides, can you see it?
Yeah, sounds very good. See it clearly.
Okay, so it's a very much fresh work. Joint work with Roman Goncharenko from Leuven, Steven Ongena from University of Zurich and many other places, and my colleagues from Central Bank of Russia, Svetlana Popova and Natalia Turgeeva. And like, let me start with the broad motivation. So here you see the picture, which shows the monthly frequency of bank failures or bank closures in Russia over the last 10 years or so, and you see the number of operating banks in Russia. And in mid-2013, you see this vertical line, which depicts the appointment of a new head of the Central Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina. And you see that exactly from this time period, the number of operating banks started to decline. And what is impressive here is almost linear trend and quite dramatic trend. And now we know that over the last 6 or 7 years, about 2/3 of all banks had been closed. So that now we have only about 350 banks or something. And what is particularly interesting here is that this dramatic trend started at least half a year before the Russian economy provided first signals on entering another recession, which then appeared in 2014, 2015, and at least like 3 or 4 quarters before Western sanctions were introduced against Russia, which makes a feeling that this was some initial decision to clean the banking system of all those problems that have been accumulated before, and I will elaborate more on this a little bit after. So now we use the term seen banks. Why do we do so? Well, if we take all these banks that have been closed, and we'll take press releases of the Central Bank of Russia, which are called Vestniki Banka России. We'll see that like 1 quarter before, the average capital adequacy ratio of the closed banks were plus 18%, which is like 10 percentage points above the minimal threshold. But then, as we know, the central bank introduces temporary administration into each and every bank, which assesses the real quality of remaining assets. And they provide the reports on these remaining assets. And we see that like 1 quarter after the closure of these banks, the capital adequacy ratio averages at minus 51%, which means like dramatic losses on bank failures, which were, as we all probably know, hidden. And sometimes we call it hidden negative capital or holes in the capital, whatever. So banks were engaged in fraud, large fraud. And just to make beautiful terms, we use SIN banks for that purpose. So the main characteristics of the policy, it's indeed very much unique because it was like not all those bad banks or SIN banks were shut down at one period of time. So like their detection and closure extended over at least 5 years horizon. And the policy thus could have both ex ante and ex post effects. Ex ante effects, they work through increased regulatory pressure on those banks that are still operating but not yet detected. And ex post effects works through destroying bank firm relationships, SIN bank firm relationships. And thus our research questions are as follows. First of all, we are interested where do the firms go after their SIN banks had been detected and closed. This is why we call it Quo Vadis. Then the second and probably most important question is the question on the real effects of these bank closures. So what happens to the firm performance after the banks were closed? And third question, which probably I will not touch tomorrow, is what happens to the not yet detected SIN banks, whether they try to improve in advance or they continue deteriorating. So like, and if we think about the contribution, well, we have two broad strands of the literature. The first one is about bank firm relationship lending. And here, like what we show, in essence, is that bad firms actually, like after SIN banks were closed, bad firms go to new SIN banks again, while good firms, they realize that time changed and they try to find another banks, good banks, not SIN banks, which we call sane banks. And we also show that this is mostly channeled through common ownership of the closed and not yet closed SIN banks. And I will talk about this later, of course. And the second strand of the literature is the one on the real effects of bank cleanup policies. And as what we show here basically is that after the SIN banks were closed, those firms that we call bad firms, they continue deteriorating, but good firms, having realized that their SIN banks were closed, they start to improve. And I will show you the channels through which this works. Okay, so there is also a strand of the literature on the regulatory forbearance, on myopia in banking, and usually people consider the cases, empirical cases of extreme regulatory forbearance, which has also some negative real effects. Here we have the opposite case when regulatory forbearance disappeared. So it's also like a unique evidence on that. So now, since the policy is that much important, let me describe it a little bit in a more detailed. So if we go to the history, we'll see like that we had the dashing 1990s, a huge increase in the number of private banks, about 2,500, if I remember correctly. So that like many of them were engaged in some illegal operations, and central bank enabled some cleanup policies, which finished mostly in 2006 with the assassination of the deputy head, Andrei Kozlov, who forced closure of two quite big banks, one foreign and one private, because he revealed illegal operations and also financing of terrorism. So he was murdered, and this created stigma to go after bad banks, which was in place up until 2013. And then in 2013, Nabiullina takes her place at the Central Bank of Russia, and we call it the end of all barons. So just a few words. It's very much a great interview which Nabiullina gave at the inauguration day in June 2013. And like in the very end of the interview, she touched this issue of regulatory stigma to go after bad banks. She said that yes, after murdering Andrei Kozlov, there was a kind of consensus not to touch, not to deal with bad banks, but now I am ready to do so. And thus this marks a new era in the Russian banking system. Okay, so the timeline of the policy. So 2013, the policy is launched. In 2014, the key features of the policy have been explicitly stated. So that the goal of the policy is to resolve these long-lasting problems in the Russian banking system and to improve stability and confidence in banks. Then in 2017, Nabiullina was reappointed. Only 4 years after, she stated that the policy should be proactive in the sense that not yet detected sin banks, they should improve themselves in advance without waiting for this unscheduled on-site inspection by the central bank. Then in end 2017, the last big banks, the cases of big banks were revealed. And after that, in February 2018, Nabiullina stated the end of the active phase of the policy. And like this is important timing for us. I will explain that. So now just a few pictures of, let's say, key banking variables within, like before, within, and after the active phase of the policy. So here on the left picture, you see loan loss provisions as a ratio to total assets, stock of loan loss provisions, and firm NPLs over total assets from the right-hand side. And the two green lines, they mark the active phase of the policy, so 2013, beginning of 2018. Also here, like I depict with the blue line, the annual GDP growth rates, just to depict the phases of the business cycle. And then you see the time evolution of the distribution of banks by loan loss provisions and firms NPLs. And what's interesting here is that, like exactly when the policy began, you see that banks started to disclose more loan loss provisions. And well, at least the dynamics of these loan loss provisions is not that much correlated with the state of the business cycle. And also firms NPLs, you see that like they started to rise, and even from 2015 to 2018, they were rising. And it was unexpectedly, right? Because from the standpoint of the business cycle, when the economy started to recover after the recession, one may expect that firms and NPLs should decline, but they were still rising because, and we attribute it to the policy. Of course, it's not causal; it's just a correlation, but still. This I will skip. Now the data. So the data is unique. So probably for the first time, when Central Bank of Russia provided an access to the credit registry data for research, at least at the think tank, which Leonid mentioned, we tried to get an access to this data at least from 2010, but we were always denied, rejected. Now we got this access. And here we have actually two data sources. The first one is called the Bureau of Credit History, which covers 2008 to 2018. This data is very much scarce. So like, I mean, what we can observe there is only the pairs, bank and firms, which is already good because we can know who provides loans to whom. But the only variable that is there is the days of loan payment delinquencies. Days of, well, then we will call it days of NPLs. So not amount of loans, not interest rates, not maturity, currency, type of loan, whatever, just days of NPLs. So in this case, it's we are very much restricted in research, but what is important for us is this matching between firms and banks. And then also the second source is like a regular credit register, which provides all these necessary data on loan amounts, interest rates, whatever, but it starts only from 2017 and up until now. So the frequency is monthly for both Bureau of Credit History and credit register, which is quite good. And like if we look,
Mikhail, if I may interrupt you real quick, looks like you're shuffling papers on your desk, and that creates some background noise. Your mic is close to the papers or whatnot. I'm not sure what causes this noise, but it's a bit an obstacle. Okay, well, thanks. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So
you can. It's fine, but just if you can.
I'll try not to move.
Okay, please do.
Yeah, so then we use standard bank balance sheets and firm balance sheets, and also to create a database on common ownership, or I call it here single ownership. We use manually collected data from Banky.ru. Okay, so some useful stylized facts from the credit register is that 70% of all firms in Russia, they have only one bank. And I checked in Belgium, for example, it is the same, just for comparative reasons. And only 1/3 of firms, they use multiple banks. Then if we see, like, if we combine Bureau of Credit History and credit register, we'll have about 700,000 of bank firm pairs. And if we trace it by years, we'll see that more and more data appears in the credit register. So that, for example, in 2010, it was very much not representative. Then what is also important is that in the credit register, we see the information on whether the loan which we observe is a new loan originated from this bank, or whether this bank bought this loan from some other bank. And like in the full sample of the credit register, we see that about 8% of all loans, they are not new, they were bought from previous bank, from some other banks. But in our subsample, which we analyze the subsample of those firms that switched from the failed banks to new banks. We see that only like a minor, very much minor fraction of loans were bought by the banks where the firm matches from the closed SIM banks. Well, it is important in the sense that when we think why firms and where do the firms go to again to SIM bank or to new same bank, it's important to realize whether this new bank buys this loan from some previous bank or whether it is a new loan. Okay, but I will leave it as it is. So now the first empirical part, where do the firms go after the SIM banks are closed? And here, so like suppose the firm F had relationship only with one bank, with the SIM bank at period T star. So as we saw from the stylized facts, 70% of all firms, they have a single bank relationship. Then like what options this firm has at for the next periods, T star +1 and so on. Well, if we think of it for like two outcomes, first one is that this firm will never find a new match, will never find a new bank. This is outcome 0, or this firm finds a new bank. It is let's just for the moment think that it's important whether the firm finds a new bank, irrespective of whether this is a seen bank again or same bank. So we'll start from investigating these two outcomes option for the firm. Then we will enlarge and we'll consider three outcomes. So we'll divide the banks where the firm goes to seen banks and sane banks, and we'll investigate what happens here. And what is our interest here is to realize whether like bad firms, they stay with seen banks forever, while good firms, being unlucky in the previous times to match with seen banks, whether now they try to find sane banks, good banks. Okay. And so here comes the results. So like what we also see in the data is that it takes on average like 35 months for the firms to find a new bank match after their seen bank was closed. And if we divide all firms into bad firms and good firms, we'll see large heterogeneity. Now, how do we divide firms on bad and good? We have two options here. The first one is what we call days of NPLs. So it comes from the Bureau of Credit History, the only variable which we can use there at monthly frequency and the most granular data. So we just assume that the more days of NPLs a firm accumulated in her previous bank at period T star, like the lower quality of this firm. So the more days of NPLs, the bad is the firm. The second option is to go at the firm's balance sheets, which are at annual basis, unfortunately, and just to construct a binary variable of whether a firm had a negative profit at period T star. Well, some people use condition that a firm should have at least 2 years of negative profit. We use both, like both definitions, but here in the baseline, we just require 1 year of negative profit at the moment of seen bank closure. And here, this denotes like whether a firm still has negative profits or losses, suffers losses at the period when the firm matches with a new bank. And here we start with these two outcomes, whether a firm find a match with some bank, seen or saint, or never matches. And like here in these first two columns, we try to understand whether having like accumulating more days of NPLs in previous banks results in less or high probability of establishing a new match. And as you can see, we find no significant relationship here. We find also no significant relationship here when we switch from days of NPLs to binary variables of negative profits. And we do find an evidence that bad firms are less likely to find a new match if at the moment of new match they they suffer losses. Well, this is intuitively because banks might reject firms that suffer losses, and this is not what we are interested in. We are interested in whether we can predict where do the firms go at the period T star. And having insignificant coefficients here made us thinking about distinguishing the directions of where do the firms go, again to seen bank or to sane bank. And thus we go to the three outcomes model. And now we investigate here in the first three columns whether a firm matches with a new seen bank. So following the firm's previous seen bank closure, whether a firm again matches with a seen bank, or whether a firm matches with a new sane bank.
Misha, may I have a tiny question? How do you define a seen bank or a sane bank?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for the question. So sin bank is an indicator variable which equals 1 if a bank is ever closed for fraud by the central bank. So it's actual data, very much straightforward. And same bank is like else. If a bank survives till the end of the sample period, which we have in the end of 2020, I guess. Okay. So, and what we see here, if we look here in column 1, we see a positive coefficient and very much significant. And here we see negative coefficient and very much significant. This means that a firm with, let's say, 100 days of NPLs would be very much more likely to establish a new match with a sin bank again, rather than with a stain bank. So these are raw coefficients, and the implied economic effects here are as follows. So if we take two firms, one with 0 days of NPLs and the other one with 100 days of NPLs, this coefficient implies that the firm with 100 days of NPLs has a kind of 35% more chance to establish a match with a sin bank. And here, this coefficient implies that this firm with 100 days of NPLs compared to a firm with 0 days of NPLs has 16% chance less to establish a match with the same bank. So this means that like bad firms, like if we try to realize that, so bad firms stay with sin banks, while good firms try to sort out to sane banks following sin bank's closure. And here we are asked to show that we were asked to show that the same results hold in not in a duration regression models, but in a simple multi-level multinomial logit model. Well, we do it here. We also show that the coefficients are the same. So bad banks stay with bad firms stay with sin banks, while good firms try to go to sane banks after sin bank's closure. Then we also, what is interesting here, we control for firm level characteristics, bank closure, event fixed effects within a region, regional fixed effects, other regional effects, industry fixed effects, but no macroeconomic conditions. And we were also asked to show that the results will survive if we include macro effects. And we did that, and we again observed the positive coefficient here and negative coefficient here, even after controlling for GDP growth rates and concentration at regional credit markets. And this means that, like, irrespective of whether this of what macroeconomic conditions we would have, we still would observe the same patterns. And this means that the policy itself could be orthogonal to macroeconomic conditions. And remember, as I told you, like that the policy started like before, for example, the economy entered a recession or sanctions were introduced. Okay, then yeah, what is important, all these results are for single bank firm relationship. If we go to multiple firm bank relationship, we will observe no significant coefficients like at all, which means that like if a firm has 2 or more banks and one bank is sin bank, which was detected and closed, the firm just go to the rest of banks in the relationship and substitute loans there. So it's very much important to focus on a single bank firm relationship. And I guess the paper by Hans de Vries, 2000 and co-authors 2019, GFI for Belgium, they established the same fact that it's very much important if you want to trace out the real effects of banks closure. You need to focus on single bank firm relationship. Okay, then like now we think what could how much time do I have? Like 10 minutes, right?
Well, yeah, about that, maybe 15, so
Okay.
you have time. Go ahead. No problem.
Okay, great. So now we try to think what are the channels through which our results work. And we start with the, oh, sorry, that again, I call it single. Now we call it common ownership problem. So we start to think of first, that imagine what we call pocket banks. When an owner of a non-financial business wants to get loans at an interest rate which is below the market interest rate, and this owner could establish its own bank or bank group, bank holding company, and then obtain loans from these pocket banks. And specifically, we were asked by Alexander Morozov, the head of the research department of the Central Bank of Russia, to check this channel. And we started to think how we can collect the data on whether a single person can be at the same time at different banks, like either owning these banks or entering the board of directors. And like we went to banki.ru, which provides real-time information on each and every failed and operating bank in Russia. And we noticed that we have names and surnames and shares in the capital of all those persons that are related to the bank. So we gathered all this information on each person from each and every bank over the last 10 years. And what we found is that from 50 to 75% of all firms in our subsample, they had relationships with SIN banks that were like owned or governed by the same persons. And this means that like now, what would happen with our regression results above with this one, for example, which is the baseline, what will happen with these coefficients when we reduce the sample by 50 or 75%. Here we had about 300,000 of observations. Well, okay, we say, let's do that. We did that. And we find that this result, that bad firms go to SIN banks again, disappears. So the number of observations dropped from 330,000 to 130,000, and the result is not there, which means that this result is fueled by the through the common ownership. While this coefficient, it now became even larger in absolute terms, meaning that this result is there, irrespectively of whether banks are owned or governed by the same persons. Good firms try to find a good bank after bad bank was failed. The second idea, or second of the three channels that we considered, is the idea that not all bank closures are similar, in the sense of not all bank closures were equally predictable from the publicly available data before period T star. And thus, like, why we think about that? Well, because the first picture, which I showed you, and the related figures imply that bad banks were misreporting, meaning that you might observe a very much good balance sheet before period T star because it was just falsified, and thus it is very much likely that some bank closures were like completely unpredictable. And just remember the case of Bank of Moscow in April 2011. Like April 1st, 2011, the Bank of Moscow reports 1.5% of firms' NPLs, which is very much low number, like three or four times less than average in the banking system. But 1 month after, and after 1 month after, the director of this bank went to London. It was revealed that the Bank of Moscow had something like 91 percent of NPLs, meaning that like banks engage in fraud and they may engage in fraud excessively. And that's what we do. We try to predict which to understand which bank failures were predictable and which were not. And if the bank failure was predictable before T-star, then the firm is in trouble. When the firm tries to find a new bank may say, well, why you were dealing with a bank whose like state was very much poor? Maybe you are poor as well. And a different situation when the bank failure was unpredictable. The new bank at period T-star plus K might say, well, okay, a firm, probably you were like also unaware of the bank's problems. And what we do a two-stage approach. At the first stage, we run a loop of 6 months moving average logit regressions within the active phase of the bad banks closure policy and predict the bank failure probabilities, and then we compare them with the actually realized events. And we say that, well, okay, if a predicted probability is above some simple threshold, let's say unconditional threshold of being failed in the Russian banking system. So if it is above, then the failure was predictable. If it is below, then it is unpredictable. What we see from the results is that maybe 75% of all cases were unpredictable. Again, supporting the view that Russian banks were engaged in fraud very much excessively. Okay. At the second stage, we do the switching model, as I showed you, on the subsamples of like what we call surprising and non-surprising bank closure events. And the results are here. Here we see this subsample of surprising bank closures at period T-star, and here we see like predictable bank closures. And as you can see, the coefficients like significant and in line with our baseline results are here, and they became like 2 times stronger or 1.5 times stronger than in the baseline. And here the coefficients are insignificant. So this means that what is important when you think about where do the firms go is whether the bank closure, the same bank closure was predictable. Okay, then the last channel is the credit market concentration at regional markets. Again, if we think about the bank's closure policy and that 2/3 of all banks had been closed, we can think about rising concentration at regional markets. And if concentration is rising, then we could have potentially different outcomes. More and more sane banks failed, more and more sane banks or good banks survived. And good banks might be willing to protect their, let's say, growing market power and might be willing to reject firms which faced sane bank closure, because probably these firms were bad firms. However, the second scenario comes from Peterson and Rajan, very much famous paper, which says that when concentration is rising, then banks with more market power might be actually willing to accept bad firms, because they could take control over these bad firms much easily than compared to the case when the firms, if the firms were good firms. So how we do that? We take again also quite unique data from the Central Bank of Russia on the branches of each and every bank in each and every region and compute regional Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And we do a little bit modification into our set of explanatory variables. So we do logarithm of the days of NPLs as before and multiply it with regional HHI index. And what we see here, we don't observe we don't find an evidence supporting the first view, which I said, like that bad firms in more concentrated markets are less likely to find a new SIN bank? Well, the coefficient is insignificant here. What is significant is here, and this is in line with Peterson and Rajan, that in more concentrated markets, bad firms might get accepted by SIN banks. Well, this is what we have here. Probably we could dig deeper into this issue and realize why these SIN banks might be willing to do so. But at this moment, we don't have an answer here. Now, just like very briefly, the placebo test. Also, one potential objection to our results might be what happens to the firms before T-star. So whether firms possess some information on upcoming bank closures and just switch in advance of SIN bank closures. Well, what we do here, we say, okay, let's consider a like reasonably short period of time before T-star, let's say half year prior to T-star, and run a logit model with dependent variable equals 1 if a firm switches in advance from a SIN bank, and 0 if it stays with the SIN bank up until T-star. And the right-hand side variables are the same. And what we observe here, we observe no significant coefficients here, meaning that firm stays with, no matter like good firm or bad firm stays with the SIN bank up until the end. We are not claiming that firms do not switch in advance. They could switch in advance if, for example, the loan matured at, I don't know, T-star -3 or T-star -1. This could happen, but it's unlikely that good or bad firms switch in advance. Then also we were asked to show whether firms might act strategically and if they still possess some information on upcoming bank closures, whether they start to delay even more loan repayments. And here we look at single firm SIN bank relationship, 12, 9, 6, 3 months prior to the SIN bank closure. And like here we have binary variable of negative profits of a firm, and dependent variable is change in the days of NPLs at the level of Bureau of Credit History. And like we could think that potentially bad firms, they are bad firms, right? They have problems with like profits and loan repayments, and if they would possess some information on the closure, we would observe some positive and significant coefficients here, but we don't, meaning that there is no such effects. If we look at multiple firm bank relationship, we also do not observe significant coefficients. So meaning that prior to T-star, everything was clean, and probably the policy was designed very much clearly, and very much, I mean, so that no information leakages were there, and neither banks nor firms could possess some information about the closures. Probably, at least these results are consistent with this view. And like the final story, which I want to show you, is what happens to the firm performance. Like again, bad firm and good firm performance. So here we do diff and diff analysis. So we take all firms that faced SIN bank closures within 2013, 2018. So they face closures at different periods of time. And we want to understand whether those firms that have already faced bank closure, their performance starts to be different from those firms that have not yet faced their SIN bank closures. We are not comparing the firms with firms operating with good banks that have never been closed. So we compare only firms that have already faced and have not yet faced bank closures. And we consider heterogeneous effects, this like treatment effect, depending on whether a firm is a bad or good. We do matching, so 1 to 4 nearest neighborhood matching estimator of Abadi and Imbens. we consider like plus minus 2 years around each bank closure. And what we require is that we consider only like those periods of time when a bank has already failed, but the firm has not yet found a new bank. So what happens to the bank performance when its previous bank was closed and the firm didn't find, has not yet found a new bank. Okay, and like we start with like average effects across good and bad firms, and we consider such indicators from firms' balance sheets as like a binary variable of whether firm has defaulted or not within these periods of time after SIM bank closure and before matching to a new bank. Leverage, like borrowed funds. Here we have logarithm of total amount of borrowed funds. And then employment in terms of number of workers. Again, log of number of workers, I guess. Then log of total sales, total revenues, log of total profits after taxes, and log of total assets, so the size of the firm. And what we observe here is very much intriguing, striking, and so on, because like now all the previous literature, starting from probably, literature exploring credit register, starting from probably Chodorov-Reich 2014 and QJE, they were considering bank credit as a source of like whatever investment for firms, consumption for households, and thus when there was negative credit supply shocks, let's say after Lehman collapse or whatever, firms deteriorate. And here, initially, we expected the same, that firms would deteriorate after even SIM bank closure. But then what you see here, negative, though insignificant, but still negative coefficient here, and positive, consistently positive coefficients across these columns implies the opposite, is that like on average, firms' performance improve, like employment rises, revenue rises, profit rises, and the size of the firm is rising after SIM bank's closure. And this makes us think that not all bank closures are equal. All those closures that were considered in the previous literature by Chodorov-Reich, Stevens, others papers, they considered like negative credit supply shocks to, let's say, good banks. Here we have SIM banks, credit supply shocks related to SIM banks, and probably why we observe that is because inferior expertise by these SIM banks. So banks, they should do expertise, right? In finding good projects, or like filtering out bad projects, okay? And here we see the opposite. Maybe finally is that we try to explore heterogeneity of these effects. And first line stands for good firms, and second line, like the sum of the first and second line, stands for bad firms. And what we observe here is that default rate of good firms is decreasing, now marginally significant. Leverage of good firms starting to rise, while that of bad firms started to decline. And the size of the firms, size of good firm is rising, and size of bad firm is declining. And not showing you these results because of lack of time. The channel which we think works here, why all this takes place, is the interest rates. In the regressions of interest rates on loans on SIM banks indicator variable and bad firms indicator variable, we show that when SIM banks were alive, they were posing lower interest rates to bad firms and higher interest rates to good firms. Meaning that after these SIM banks are closed and both good and bad firms enter the market does its job. The market declines interest rates to good firms, but raises interest rates for bad firms. And this could explain, at least rationalize, why we observe improving firm performance of good firms after SIN bank's closure, and declining firm performance in case of bad firms. Okay, so sorry for taking too much time. I will probably skip all these results.
Well, Mikhail, if you can summarize in a couple of minutes, that would be appreciated. We'll have some time for discussion then. Thanks.
Yeah, so here is the summary, is that we explore a unique bank cleanup policy of the Bank of Russia, which strengthened in time. First study to show how firms match with new banks following their SIN bank closures. And our estimation results, they show that bad firms match with another SIN banks, especially if owned by the same owners. And like we show that good firms, they try to match with same banks. This matching takes place only if closures of SIN banks were surprises. And also what is important is that performance of good firms improve and that of bad firms deteriorate. Also, I didn't show that, but the last section of the analysis is that we show that the policy was indeed proactive in the sense that not yet detected SIN banks were trying to improve in advance before central bank arrival. This is it. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Lots of good food for thought. We have some time for discussion. Questions and answers, please, and comments, if any. Mikhail, may I ask you to please clarify, you explained which banks are deemed to be bad, those that were selected by the central bank for their misbehavior. Can you remind what is a good firm and a bad firm? I kind of missed it. What is the definition of good and bad firms?
You mean good and bad firms or banks?
Firms. No, in case of banks, you explain, but firms.
Yeah, firms. So
what is a good firm? What is a bad firm?
So here we try to use two options to define bad firm. One is a sort of continuous option, which stems from Bureau of Credit History, like days of NPLs. Like we observed in the data that some firms might have 0 days of NPLs, and we call these firms like very good firms.
Zero, pardon me, can you repeat that, please? 0 what?
Like 0 days of loan repayment.
Oh, okay, all right, yeah, okay, yes, right, okay, performance, okay.
Yeah. So, and we have some firms with above 180 days. The maximum was 1,000 days. Okay. So, like the more days of NPLs you have, the less quality of the firm. So it's a continuous measure. Let's leave it here. And the second is measured at the annual basis, is an indicator variable of whether a firm has losses or negative profits or not. So if a firm has negative profit, we call it a bad firm. If it has like positive profits, we call it a good firm. Also, try to be kind of straightforward in the definitions.
Well, I think there is a slight inconsistency in the terminology, in my opinion, because when you talk about good banks and bad banks, a bad bank is a fraudulent bank. Is a bank which is taking advantage of lax regulation, and in case of firms, it's if a firm is financially successful or unsuccessful. So maybe instead of good and bad firms, we talk about a firm can be genuinely delinquent, just bad luck and whatnot. Performing firms and non-performing firms, because you use the same term to describe potentially different phenomena, in my opinion. So it's not a big deal, but just for clarification purposes. And then, of course, that's a good question. If a non-performing firm is indeed a bad firm, in that if it is a fraudulent firm, which matches with a fraudulent bank to collude for some purposes, for money laundering and whatnot. So, okay, thanks for clarifying this. Q&As, please, comments, questions. There are quite a few people in the room who are experts in banking, so I'm sure there might be some.
May I start then?
Please.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'll start with continuing the discussion of the definition of SIN and SAN banks. Actually, I just wondered, do you consider only those license withdrawals which were due to any fraud, not for the financial reasons, because there were plenty license withdrawals because of the financial reasons. So we have bad banks in terms of pure financial ratios. So do you consider those bankruptcies without any fraud?
Yeah, so if we go to the press releases, which accompany each and every bank closure in Russia, we'll see like many reasons. Some of them are not related to fraud, and we see in the sample that 15% of all banks were just liquidated because like bank owners just lost interest in developing banking businesses, and like these were foreign banks or some private banks, and they just like closed the banks themselves. So it was not related to fraud, and this is not here. So all like at least 15% of observations, they are not here, and their firms not here. So Sin Bank is only the bank which faced license revocation due to fraud revealed. So it has to be associated with wastage of capital, and we see that some banks their capital adequacy ratio after license revocation was only -1% of risk-weighted assets, and some banks had -74%, with the average of -51%, as I told you in the beginning. Yeah. So this should be those banks that were engaged in some sort of bank misreporting.
So did I hear correctly that there were almost no bankruptcies only because of the correctly reported but bad financial indicators? Imagine a bank.
Correctly reported, but there was these cases, but they were not associated with wastage of capital. So they still had capital adequacy ratio at least slightly above 0. Okay. Not above 8%, but above 0, like 2%. Yeah.
Why I'm asking, because you know, those bankruptcies are at least they seem to be easier to predict, including prediction by the market, by outsiders. There is some literature showing that the firms, the borrowers, do care indeed about the financial quality of the banks, meaning that they think of the financial indicators. And in your story, you're trying to tell the story of predicting the misreporting. This is more complicated for firms, especially if they are pure outsiders, not related to some bank managers. And that may, to some degree, blur your story on the prediction on the surprise license revocation. And maybe you should try, at least as a robustness check, try to focus on those bankruptcies which are not only because of the fraud, which is listed in the list of the reasons of the license revocation, but also if there is the financial reasons within the overall list of the reasons of the license revocation. Maybe for this type of bankruptcies, you will see some new results on your surprising and non-surprising bankruptcies. Because it's impossible to predict something which is quite well hidden. That's naturally there.
Yeah, that's the point.
And
that's the point.
And another, I'm just curious, but I think that it would help much if you tell us the story of what happens with the borrower with his loans when the license is revocated. Because of course it doesn't mean for a borrower that he can get relaxed on the loans. He still needs to repay.
So why it's
yes, why it's more complicated for a firm to repay to some new lender, to a firm or to a bank who bought those loans. This is the question of why the borrower should care about the financial stability of a bank. especially if we are talking about a bad firm, which may not care much about the very long future of the operations. Because of course we are interested in stable relationship. If we are thinking on a long horizon, but if we are not, why should we care? And if it's so, we can get your stories a little bit closer to the issue of supply and demand for loans, right? Because every time when we deal with the data on the loan contracts, we do not know exactly whether it's mostly the supply side or the demand side. So we have quite a long period, at least in your data, from the moment when the bank was bankrupt till the moment when the firm matched with a new bank. It's somewhat about a year and a half, even for a bad firm, right? So during that period of time, we do not know whether a firm were seeking for a loan and were rejected again and again, or this firm didn't need any loan. You have almost 85, if I'm not mistaken, 85% of the firms who didn't get any new credit. And again, we do not know whether they were rejected or they just don't need one. So this is something which is always complicated to catch in the data. That's why my feeling is that you just need some more stories to be told here, at least how you consider the decision-making process here. Who cares about what and when, right? And my final comment, at least for now, I was again curious about whether it is possible to check any informational rent hypothesis in your last part of the bank firm story, because you are saying that the good firms were enhancing their ratios. Almost all the ratios were enhanced. And some of your hypothesis was related to the interest rates, which you didn't show us now, but it was in the paper. And my feeling is that you can use your data, at least from the firm's financial statements, to check whether the length of the credit influences the interest rates, which would signal us the informational rent extraction. I guess Steven knows much better about the mechanisms there, but there are some papers, including the one by Steven, showing that long relationships surprisingly increase the interest rates, which the borrowers have to face, even the good borrowers. And that's the problem of the firms being informationally captured within the banks, including the bad banks. They cannot go outside and still have to repay those high interest rates. Maybe if you have at least some proxies for the maturity of the loans you are dealing with the same bank, you may check this hypothesis, and that would demonstrate this problem, explaining why the interest rates are higher for good firms, because nobody wants to lose good borrowers.
Maria, let's give a chance to Mikhail to respond, please.
I'm sorry, I'm too talkative.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
No, it's all good stuff, but we're running out of time. Mikhail, please.
Well, thank you for the feedback. Try to be quick. So, license revocation due to financial reasons. Well, actually engaging in fraud also involves financial reasons, right? Because like central bank explicitly writes that it was aggressive credit strategy, misreported quality of loans, insufficient amount of loan was provisioned, so that if you would do that fairly, you will lose the capital like fully. It's also like financial reasons. So now fraud could be like illegal fraud when you do money laundering or whatever, or it could be like just due to financial mistakes, whatever. Here we don't disaggregate the two, but I guess we could do that because we could separate these two types of bank misreporting. Then what is important, like this supply and demand story, we were thinking a lot about that. So when the bank is closed at period T star, the firm the pool of firms, they are now, their loans belong to the receiver, and they continue repaying these loans, of course. But then what the receiver is doing is organizing an auction where the receiver is trying to sell these loans. And if the loans are bad loans, nobody buys them, or maybe collector agencies buy them. If the loans are like of higher quality, then probably some good banks or some other firms, or even by the law, even single persons may buy it through the auctions in Russia, at least. And here we studied a lot of anecdotal evidence, which shows that like firms, if they are good firms, they try to escape the situation when some other bank at the auction buys the firm's credit. They try to find, like these firms, they try to go to, let's say, Sberbank, tell the Sberbank, like, look, guy, give me money, I will repay my previous loan, and I will try to establish a relationship with you. So a lot of anecdotal evidence shows that. Then I said that like average duration of the spell, average time it takes for a firm to find a new bank is 35 months. If we consider time it takes for a firm to find another seen bank, it reduces from 35 to 18 months. So much quicker, meaning that this like common ownership works. And time it takes for a firm to find a new good bank, it's 45 months. So much larger. And then, at least when the credit register starts from 2017, not all the period which we consider, but what we found is that when a firm finds a new good bank in these 45 months, the loan amount in the closed bank and in the new bank are uncomparable at all. And here we studied anecdotal evidence which showed that like in media, many of the cases were covered, and they showed that like these are completely new loans. So when a firm finds a new good bank, it's a completely new loan. Of course, when they establish a relationship, there are supply and demand side effects, because the bank should be willing to accept the firm. Yeah. So we need to consider it more. And okay, let me stop here because I want to
okay, yeah, very good.
Alexei and Masha, thank you.
Any other questions, please? Thanks very
Alexei
much.
has been waiting for a while, so please.
Okay, of course.
Yeah,
right, Alexei,
thanks.
please.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. So it's sort of two broad sets of thoughts. One is still going to what Masha already said about the definition. So maybe first a clarification is, I understand that some closed banks can be saint banks, but I still don't have a good example of which closed bank would be qualified for being a saint bank. So then the next one is, why is this definition so important to your story? So you focus on these fraudulent banks and not on these other banks that are possibly also closed for other reasons than non-fraud. And it seems like it's key to your story, but I have not exactly figured out why. And the reason I think about this is back to because of course, once I understand better why, I also see all kinds of possibilities for exploring more the heterogeneity in these bank failure reasons. So that's kind of the potential that I'm thinking about. Maybe I'll do the second question as well. I think I can keep it also short and general. So that's the first one, is what exactly the definition, why exactly you do it this way, and then why not all the other sources of potential heterogeneity in bank failure reasons. And the second one was on firms. I saw that in all the, it's highly, I would like to see the summary statistics of, let's call them bad and good firms, if you like. I do see that you have firm controls in most of your specifications. I'm really curious to see what kind of controls and how they actually, whether they show up with the signs that make sense and whether what you would expect. So that's sort of this general second line of questions. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Alexei. Well, let's start from the second. It's simpler. Well, in the paper, of course, we have it, and controls like here. So we have firm size. We have firm size squared also, but it's not that important. We could drop it. Well, we have some rationale for that, but I could skip it now. Leverage and liquidity. So the idea was to keep the simple set of firm controls, and we also show that like with firm controls, without firm controls, more or less we get the same results. And like in general, what we obtain is that firms, larger firms, they it's easier for them to find a new match, new bank. Well, okay. More levered firm, they are less likely to find a new match, also intuitive. But from the liquidity position, like no effect. The summary statistic, like very much in general, here, for example, the average days of NPLs is about 60 days. Between 30 and 60. Okay, I don't remember now. I need to look at the paper. Then indicator variable of negative profits. It's about 15% is the mean. So 15% of firms were classified as bad firms with this definition. Seen banks indicator variable, the mean is about 56%. Like, so a lot of seen banks. Why we choose this definition, like whether a bank was closed due to fraud, irrespective of, like Masha said, whether the fraud was due to illegal activities or fraud due to financial reasons. Well, because probably this was the essence of the policy, is that the policy targeted banks that did misreporting. Of course, policy also should cover those banks with capital adequacy ratios still positive, but below the threshold, below 8%. Yeah, but like all the discussions with the central bank, all the interviews of Nabiullina and her deputy heads show that like the focus was on those banks that lost their capital but tried to hide it. Banks with capital adequacy ratios below 0.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So maybe just I haven't thought it through, and you may, upon reflection, you may think, well, it makes no sense. Perhaps I would, but let's say, would it be interesting then to take, say, a group of bank closures that is definitely not targeted by this policy, and see whether your results survive? For example, let's say voluntary liquidations, or maybe even mergers. I don't know I don't know whether what your story would look like for those, but it's also a bank closure. Perhaps it could just be interpreted as a placebo test. But so this is the kind of what was going on in my head, is there are all these kind of other different types of bank closures. What happens with those? Would it be interesting to see, at least as a placebo?
Yeah, so at least, well, okay, as I also told you, like 15% of all bank closures were voluntary bank closures, when it was not from the Central Bank of Russia, it was the bank owners who decided to close their banks. And we checked, like they still had like positive capital, even like above the regulatory threshold of 8%, but like, I don't know, probably these bank owners found that investing into some other industry would get them more return, probably like that. And here, intuitively, I don't think that the real effects would be the same. But probably they could be. I don't know. Here, what is interesting is that if you close a bank that misreport, you might expect that this bank is doing a poor job in terms of expertise, in terms of the core banking function. thus, if you think about firms that are with this bank, like good firms and bad firms, this is interesting what happens to them, and what we show is that like good firms, they improve, bad firms deteriorate. Also, what is interesting, like 1 month ago at BOFIT, there was a seminar by Sofia Khramyak from Kyiv School of Economics, who's now doing a paper with professors from Chicago. And like the point is that in Ukraine, they had a very much similar policy on bad banks closure. Well, about 100 banks were closed. We had about like 600 banks closed. They had 100 banks closed. And these guys, they investigated the real effects on firm performance, on firm employment, and they found consistently only negative effects. So that after even this bad banks closure, the firm performance deteriorated. So it seems that now people start thinking more about the real effects of bad banks closures.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at this because we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
Is there anyone who really wants to ask a quick question, final question, and we'll ask Mikhail to answer? I don't see any, Mikhail.
I do.
Oh, you do, but
Hello.
sorry, if you can please do it real quick because we have 5 minutes
Sure,
left.
yes. Mikhail, I probably missed, how do you treat firms closures, firms bankruptcies? Could your last result be driven by survivorship bias, that some firms just after bank closures went bankrupt and only good firms survived?
And only good firms survived. No, we like explicitly we haven't addressed this issue, so we just like on average or descriptively consider the cases when firm like defaulted or not from the raw data. But yeah, this is what we should think. I don't have an answer, so just not to take your time now.
No, I second
let me think.
Vladimir. I think it's a good question actually. So
let me think on it. Yeah,
very much worth thinking about this. So Vladimir, many thanks for bringing this up.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight, and it remains for me to once again thank Mikhail for very rich and thought-provoking presentation. It's a good start of the year, and Bernardo usually joins me in doing the same and also announces what happens next. So Bernardo, can you please?
Well, first of all, thanks, Mikhail, for your presentation. I think, and well, thanks everyone for this very interactive session. Which is shows that the fact that we're running out of time shows that you have like a very interested audience.
Yes, right.
So yeah, thanks everyone for that. And well, in a couple of weeks we have Sergey Popov, who was here but he had to leave early today, and he's going to present his paper on tactical refereeing. So that's going to be on the 3rd of February. So in 2 weeks' time, same time, same place. So yeah, please join us. And yeah, wish you everyone a nice evening and a good weekend.